Thank you for coming to this Policy Exchange Fringe. Thank you, Policy Exchange, for pulling this together and for choosing such an important topic. You can see from the brief on your chairs that there is quite a lot to cover. I think that personally there's very little that is more important going on at the moment than working out how we respond and how we exercise some sort of reasonable control over the internet, over social media, to the benefit of people, but not in a way that makes them think that government is trying to interfere. I'm the government and I'm here to help never goes down very well. So I'm pleased to say that we've got some really excellent experts to join us in the discussion. I'm going to shortly invite each of them to introduce themselves and to speak for a few minutes only, because I can see that in this room we've got quite a lot of expertise and quite a lot of people who've shown real interest in this subject, and I want to give everybody a chance to ask questions and to get a response. But let me start by introducing everybody. On my left I've got Damian Collins, who many of you will know is chair of the DCMS Select Committee and has really done a huge amount of work in what's going on the internet in terms of interfering with our democracy. On his left we've got Jamie Bartlett, who is a writer and author on the tech sector in general and has really done some fantastic groundbreaking work on really contemporary challenges in this area. On my right I've got Julian Enoizi, who is from CEO Pool Reinsurance, and his company is trying to work out how to handle insurance of terrorism, particularly cybersecurity influenced terrorism. And on his right, Paddy McGuinness, who I worked with when I was Home Secretary, who was Deputy National Security Advisor and has fantastic experience in this area as well. So I hope you'll find some good responses and some interesting comments from all our panellists. And I'm going to start by inviting Damian to make some comments about what his committee is doing and where he sees the big challenges ahead of us.
Great. Amber, thank you very much. The Select Committee I chair has been conducting for most of this year an inquiry into disinformation and fake news. We published our interim report at the end of July, and we're looking to publish our final report at the end of this year. I'll just say a few things about that inquiry, which mainly looks at the news media side and the disruptive nature of social media for democracy, depending on how people use those tools. I'll probably let other members of the panel say more on the security area, which is where certainly their expertise lies and where we didn't do quite so much in our investigation. But there are two key things for me. One is really is a question of content. How do you deal with and address bad and harmful content online? There is where you have content that may incite people to commit criminal acts, may target people aggressively and unfairly. Who is responsible for that content? At the moment, we largely say it's the people that have posted it. But what if those people are hard to trace? What liability should there be for the tech companies that host that content, be it a recruitment video on YouTube that's been placed there by a group linked to ISIS, or something which is a piece of political communication seeking to influence the way people vote? And what we've said is that we believe where harmful content is identified and is referred to the social media company, they should have a liability then to remove that content. This is not about suppressing freedom of speech, it's about often getting rid of content that is illegal. Now, there is another area as well, which is around where I think data targeting and data analytics becomes so important as well. Because what we've seen is that disinformation, fake news doesn't just spread through the internet because it's interesting, because the fake stuff is more interesting than the real stuff. It is also targeted, and individuals are targeted to receive particular forms of content, and they don't always know where it comes from. And that's where the idea of this being a threat for democracy comes from as well. If you are viewing a political ad on Facebook that you think has been placed by someone who is like you, who lives in the same country as you, who shares your values and concerns, and yet that has not been placed there by someone like you, but it's been placed there by the Russian government, who are maybe trying to interfere with the sound effects now, then you've got a right to know. So you don't. At the moment, we've had an ecology that has existed around news through social media and political content through social media, where the user doesn't know the origins of the content, and that's where it becomes a threat to democracy, where people can, through mass networks of fake accounts, game the system and seek to influence and shape the way people see news. We live in a world now where increasingly people don't get their news from a curated space like a newspaper or a television broadcast. They get it in bite-sized chunks shared through social media. In the UK, over half of people now consume news in that way. You go to countries like Mexico and you'll find it's 80% of people consume news in that way. And therefore, what goes on online is increasingly important, particularly if people can game the system, where we're consuming news that's not been edited by a professional, but it's being edited by an algorithm, and you can influence the way that algorithm performs. And when people talk about the threat to democracy that exists at the moment, that it comes in the way, and the way these tools can be gamed, and the lack of information the user has to allow them to decide what weight they place on the different bits of content that they see.
Thank you very much, Damian. Jamie.
Thanks everyone for having me. Thanks, Amber. To answer the question directly, I don't think big tech is such a big problem for national security. I think small tech is probably a bigger problem. The democratization of various tools that allow people, especially the criminal justice system, perhaps more than terrorism, to be able to do things that are extraordinarily difficult now for the police to prosecute. And I can only see this getting worse. The focus on terrorism is slightly unhelpful in that sense. I really think that the police are going through, and are going to continue to go through, an incredibly serious enforcement crisis where they are simply not able to prosecute law in the way that they were able to 10 years ago. And this really leads to the second part of the problem, which is the threat to democracy from technology. And I see it this way: rather than trying to sort of blame Bezos or Zuckerberg or Dorsey or Musk or whoever, it's really quite simple. We have a very old set of institutions that were built up at a very particular time with a particular set of technologies, and suddenly we have digital technology which does not follow the same rules, it doesn't follow the same logic, it doesn't follow the same incentives. And the two things just simply do not work very well together. What I fear more than anything is that people just lose faith slowly, gradually, but imperceptibly, almost, in the institutions of democracy itself. So rather than saying Cambridge Analytica stole the election in America, which is, I think, a lot of, frankly, liberals who are refusing to accept the result, and they find it easier to blame Nix than they do to blame Hillary Clinton, the truth of that is it's the inability of regulators to actually be able to monitor the sorts of adverts that people are getting, and a belief amongst the voters that they don't know what to trust. Who's on this? Who's monitoring this stuff? Who's monitoring the spending? And I find that that's a much deeper problem, because where we are now is only the beginning. Imagine in 10 or 15, 20 years' time, how much more advanced our data targeting will be, how much more data will be out there, how much more powerful these tiny addictive devices in our pockets are actually going to be. And then think about how serious the threat to our existing way of doing democracy will be. So can the regulators keep up with elections? What about citizens' ability to actually engage in reasonable debate with each other when we see the explosion of deep fake technology that allows anybody to make a video making anybody say anything? And the problems that that is going to create. The ability for us to raise taxes as more and more industry becomes software-based and far easier to base overseas. So these are the threats, the long-term, 10-year threats to the institutions of democracy, people's trust in them. And I fear that what will happen is that people will start turning away both from technology and start smashing this stuff up, like the Luddites in the 1815s, 1820s, and they'll turn away from democracy too, and they'll start wanting to go for the authoritarians who promise to bring order to such chaos. And that would be a disaster, and that's what we have to avoid.
Wow, that's breathtaking concerns for us all in the future. Thank you, Jamie. Paddy.
Thank you very much. When I was, as Amber said, working with, I think I probably was the manifestation of the deep state. So think of me as the deep state in recovery as I speak to you. Okay. And I'm going to say something about cybersecurity. I'm going to say something about terrorism. I'm going to say something about state action online. But first of all, I just wanted to share four kind of, for me, key points, building on what Damian and James have said. And the first one is that consistently, policy makers and regulators have been behind the game when it comes to technology and tech companies. And frankly, they've been allowed to set the regulatory frame to some extent and set the discourse. And so we just need to think of ourselves not just to intervene on what bothers us today, but also the way in which the technology is developing, and I think James was getting at that, because otherwise we'll misdirect our efforts and they'll be ahead of us again. So we need to get ahead of this. The second thought I have is that we mustn't be distracted, and this is also, James has made a point like this, we mustn't be distracted by the ephemeral internet. Now, I can tell you what the ephemeral internet is, because when my 16-year-old daughter tells me she can't live without it, I know that's the ephemeral internet. Okay, and that there's a set of things that really matter to us, which is the Internet of Things, that's actually going to make our economy work, yeah, and those systems and processes that really underlie our lives, so ubiquitous software and the like. So we need to focus on those and not be distracted. The third is that, and a personal view, the aggregation and analysis of data at huge scale is an enormous public good. And out of that is going to come a large part of our prosperity and well-being, our health, if nothing else. And therefore it's absolutely vital that we create the conditions where that kind of aggregation and use of data can take place. Yeah? And that puts a heavy weight on the defensive, the way in which we organise ourselves so we can have public consent. And fourthly, that we've got to accept that because we are a developed economy, our infrastructure is simply more vulnerable than the infrastructure of others. And that therefore, rather than thinking that we can establish deterrence through striking, except possibly against non-state groups, we establish deterrence by being strongly defended. We, to use a phrase, coin a phrase, confound their knavish tricks rather than go and mess about in their infrastructure. So, three thoughts about, one about cyber, one about terrorism, and one about state action. First of all, we all need, if we're going to talk in this area, to understand what is happening to ensure cyber security, because the tech companies might do a bit for us on the other issues, but on cyber security they'll do everything for us, and it drives the development of their tools. When they touch a 1 and a 0, they touch it for cyber security purposes. You can use the same techniques to deal with the other harms that come online, potentially, if you're asking the tech companies to do it. And we need to understand that they take a very firm position to stop malware going around their systems. Unfortunately, in our infrastructure, we're still at the beginner's stage on cybersecurity. There are still 75% of the malware you find, ubiquitous malware, is eminently preventable, isn't being prevented. So for terrorism, there's a very heavy focus, and quite rightly, and Damian had it in his comments, on the contents. But all of you who use Facebook or indeed Instagram will know, for instance, as there are other applications available, will know that when you look at a piece of content, you are also in touch with the poster. So I would like to suggest that the critical thing we need to do if we're going to counter Islamic State or child abusers is to focus almost more on the poster than the post, and get the companies to do that too, because you might find the contents of a post is actually neutral. A nice, handsome jihadi stroking a cat or showing you Nutella that makes a young girl in East London think it'd be nice to go to Islamic State. Nothing wrong with it, except that she's being radicalised and drawn away. Concentrate on the poster. And then, in terms of state action, and this is one thing where I kind of slightly, well, I think I do agree with James, but some aspects of his book maybe I don't, is that state, we mustn't do Russia's work, and indeed the tech companies' work, by exaggerating the effect they can have. If the Russians' purpose is to put us off balance, saying, oh, there's been a suspicious post, our election isn't valid, is a disaster, because it plays to their... So we need to have a really grounded view of what state action means. I also think that we need to use existing mechanisms, and I think James was poking at that. We need to modernise existing mechanisms because they have legitimacy in managing our democracy. And a final thought for you, and I feel this really quite strongly coming out of government, we need some mechanism for attributing and countering what happens to us that is agreed internationally. Didn't the Salisbury attack response go well because of the work of the OPCW? Apparently moribund organisation that said, oh yeah, hang on, this was Novichok, and yeah, actually Russia's responsible for that, and actually set the frame within which 60 or 70 countries could respond. I think we need that for cyber. There's a lot of resistance, but I think we need that for cyber.
Okay, thank you very much, Paddy, for that very interesting canter through the various challenges. Julian.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I'm sure everybody here is really looking forward to the insurance part of this debate. It's usually the big draw, but I just want to outline to you something that the British government, in collaboration with industry, has been doing for the past 25 years in what we call difficult to insure risks. And terrorism is a difficult to insure risk because you don't know how often it's going to occur, and therefore it's very difficult to apply a premium to it. And that's about as much as I'll say on a technical side. But what the British government did 25 years ago was form a public-private partnership with the insurance industry so that terrorism could be insured or continue to be insured by providing a backstop, a guarantee that if ever the insurance industry ran out of money, the government would step in. And I'm pleased to say that 25 years on and 16 attacks, we have been able to pay as a mutual reinsurance company out of our own reserves with no call on the taxpayer. The reason I give you that background is because, of course, terrorism is very different today to what it was 25 years ago, where you had explosions that were caused by truck bombs typically being left outside buildings. Today, you can cause that same explosion by sitting behind a computer in Kazakhstan. So that physical damage can be caused by remote digital interference without the necessity of risking being caught, or at least being caught in flagrante. The other thing that's really important about cyber is that we in insurance grew up insuring physical assets, houses, cars. Today, that is only 15% of the market. 85% of the market is intangibles. Brand, reputation, supply chain, and of course cyber, which really cuts across virtually everything we do. And you've heard talk of aggregation. Well, what that means is if you were causing an explosion using a truck bomb, you know that there's a limited amount of radius that you can cause damage to. With cyber, that can really cause you damage from Land's End to John O'Groats. And that's why it's so difficult to insure, because of that aggregation risk. The other thing I should point out, there's something like £1 trillion worth of exposure in the cyber market and only £4 billion worth of premium. So what that tells you is that people do not understand this risk. The insurance industry does not understand this risk and is finding it really, really difficult to grapple with it. Earlier this year, we expanded our cover from physical terrorism to cyber terrorism. So we included cyber terrorism in our cover. It was the result of 2.5 years of work with the Cambridge University to understand the risk, to understand what the threat vectors are, who the threat actors are, so that we could expand our coverage, so that we knew what we were doing. And really, we're future-proofing the cover. There's no suggestion at the moment that there's actually been a cyber terrorism event, but if there were one in the future, we would at least be able to say that we had covered that. And the other thing we do is we work internationally. There are my equivalents around the world. They're all grappling with exactly the same thing. This is a global problem. And the last thing I'll say, just referring back to Paddy's words, confounding their knavish tricks, one of the beauties of the insurance industry is that it can be used to incentivize behavior. In other words, we can help implement risk mitigation. I think you said that 75% of malware is preventable. Well, we can help prevent that by incentivizing people to put in place those government-accredited measures, things like Cyber Essentials, 10-step to cybersecurity, in return for premium reduction on the policy. And these are all things where I think the public and the private sector have to work more closely together.
Thank you very much, Julian. In my experience as Home Secretary, we had some success with engaging with the large internet and social media companies to get them to take terrorist material down, and persuaded them to set up a global internet forum for counter-terrorism where there has been a concerted effort and reduction in terrorist material online. But it seems to me that talking about taking terrorist material offline is a clearer request than trying to get the social media companies to engage in making our democracies clearer, fairer, more transparent. So I'm going to kick off the discussions, if I may, on the whole area that particularly Jamie and Damian were referring to, about how to protect our democracy. And the point, Jamie, that you made particularly about we're now in a different world, that our laws were not made for this, and we are in real danger of sleepwalking to a place where all the data is being aggregated about us so fast, and as Damian said, that there is room for mischief, for hostile state action to interfere with the messaging in a way we don't understand, that it could really impact adversely on our, what we hold dear to our country is a really strong democratic position. Engaging with internet companies, unfortunately, from my experience on the terrorist side, everybody knows they want to stop terrorism. In terms of messaging and controlling and transparency on social media, it's much harder, because the nature of social media companies quite often is that they feel they very much have the moral high ground. Government represents something, well, let's face it, potentially evil. And after all the Snowden leaks that took place, they really want to keep us at arm's length. Jamie, could I ask you just to expand on one or two of your points, to say, where do you think the onus lies? Do you think it's for government to try to get through new legislation to try and put the responsibility on social media and internet companies, or do you think it's for them to take the responsibility, egged on by their users, to do more to make it transparent, to protect us all from hostile state interference that we don't know is taking place?
Well, egged on by their users, but also egged on by their sponsors and the
Yes.
people that pay for the adverts, because obviously that is the bottom line. And I think that it's amazing how much public opinion has shifted in the last year on this subject to do with technology.
Yes.
They were always the cool guys that turned up to the office on a skateboard in a t-shirt. That's not the man. You know, the man are the people in this room.
Yeah.
But that is no longer how people see this. I think they understand that things are quite different. And so I think public opinion moving has been very helpful to give enough space for regulators like yourself and Damian and others, and sponsors and users to have something of a concerted fight back. And so a couple of things that I think are really important, Damian's talked about this a lot, is simply making the electoral law up to speed with existing, up to speed with digital technology. So every single advert that is run online should be published for everyone to see. And not only that, who is targeted with that advert? It's going to be a really long and boring Excel spreadsheet, but someone, journalists, will go through that and figure it out. You probably need to do an investigation into the whole ad tech industry, because there's an awful lot that's not transparent about that, and that is where the whole social media platform business model depends on this. But at the same time, the recent thing that a lot of people were frustrated about, the GDPR, the European Union data protection stuff, is I think going to be a really useful tool for citizens to try to claw some of their data back. You have a right to data portability. You can remove data from these platforms. We need to incentivize a private sector to help people to do that easily, so we can see our data. If we keep hearing that data is the new oil of the new economy, well, then we need to be a bit more responsible in how we use it and who we give it to and what we share, but also have easier ways of pulling it back and exercising rights over that. And I don't think the tech companies will do a great deal, except when they begin to believe that people don't like their platforms anymore. I.e., one of the reasons a lot of the tech companies are acting now is because I think the founders in their 20s didn't really care. Now they're in their 30s and they have small children, and they watch them looking at their smartphones thinking, oh my goodness me, what have we done?
Yeah.
So they are beginning to move, but a lot of that is driven by public attitude. So if we start being more responsible with our data, we try and enforce our GDPR rights, we start looking for alternatives to some of these big tech platforms which are out there. You lot are sort of tougher with them,
Yep.
with that smart regulation on things that are especially about bringing old laws up to speed. And I think we're getting somewhere, but it's still going to be a big challenge.
I think that's so helpful. I mean, you're absolutely right. Public attitudes, and then government needs to lead, but government cannot do it in the face of public opposition. So with public attitudes changing, the government can lead and take them with us. Damian, do you want to add a comment? And then I'm going to open it up for any other questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And we should set the framework within which these companies are required to operate. And it can be, some people say, well, these are multinational companies, how can you do it in one country? Well, they are. If you go to Germany, in Germany, any posting on Facebook that is accessible in Germany that is in breach of the German hate speech laws has to be removed by Facebook, otherwise they become liable for it. And they do it. And about 1 in 6 people in the world now who work for Facebook checking content do so checking it with regards to the German market. So they've invested in it. The reason Mark Zuckerberg in his, managed to successfully talk down the Facebook share price was because he warned their investors that they would have to start to spend more on compliance around the world. That this was a new trend. most of the issues that exist at the moment around these tech companies are a consequence of the tools that they have created to make money, to sell ads, to run ads. So the issues around data targeting of users on Facebook are because those are the way the ad tools have been designed. So the fact that you, as a Facebook user, may choose that you don't wish your political opinions to be revealed, but nevertheless Facebook can guess what they are and sell you an advertising package to an advertiser, so you can be targeted with political messaging that's been tailored for you, even though you never wanted that information to be shared with anyone. And that's allowed because those are the way the ad tools have been designed. A lot of the concerns around data breaches with Facebook partly existed because Facebook allowed developers to access anonymized user data to create new tools to tempt people to stay on the site longer and do more there. So these businesses are based on knowing absolutely everything you possibly could ever want to know about an individual user on the platform. So academics have said that you can more easily predict someone's behavior by looking at their Facebook likes than you could by asking their closest friend. Now, if these tools have been developed to make money, to run ads, I'm sure these same tools could be used to identify harmful content when it's out there. And a lot of the bad stuff too is caused by fake accounts, which already by the guidelines of the tech companies themselves shouldn't be there. And I think we should use some of the old world tools we have in this space. So if Facebook and YouTube are selling audiences to advertisers, but the number of fake accounts in those audiences is far greater than they admit, well, isn't that fraud?
Yeah.
Shouldn't the CMA be investigating that? I think there's a lot of tools that we do have we could use, but I think in the framework, and I think as the government brings forward the internet safety strategy, I think what we have to look at is not just getting rid of the platform neutrality, which their defence that they use, creating limited liability for the most harmful content. We can all agree what the most harmful is as well, but there's some content that's harmful that isn't necessarily illegal. And as Jamie touched on, when you start looking at deep fake films, we're going to need a mechanism whereby in an election campaign we can go to a tech company and say, this is a made-up film, everyone knows it's a made-up film, yet it's being shared as if it's real on your site.
Yeah.
You've got to do something about it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Damian. Yes, people need to be more aware of that. And I agree, Jamie, it is interesting the way we see increasingly these social media or internet tycoons who arrive at their 30s and stop their children using Facebook, etc. No, I don't let mine go on it. Right, okay, let's have some questions. And could I ask people, please, to say who they are and then to give us a short question? This gentleman and this gentleman. We'll take two at a time, please. Yes. Could you stand up and say who you are? So sorry, because we can't quite hear you.
Sorry, Andrew Campbell from BT Group. A couple of quick comments. Firstly, often talk about internet companies and conflate that with social media companies. I think they're quite different. I think internet companies and social media companies are not the same thing, but they're often talked about as being the same, yet you would approach them differently. Whilst more regulation is needed, I would advise it focuses on the harms, not on the technology, because otherwise you get distracted by the technology and that's a rabbit hole you can disappear down rather than just easily focus on the harms. Please put more effort into education, because actually you'll never out-regulate things, whereas if you educate people and improve their critical reasoning, they can solve a lot of the problems themselves. And finally, one country which has solved a lot of the problems of fake news is China. I'm not sure we want to go there. I would strongly urge we need a third party that's not government, not the private sector, that decides what is extremist content. Because you don't think you want us deciding, and frankly I don't think we want the government deciding. Otherwise we do end up like China.
Thank you very much. Gentleman in front of you. Thanks.
Hi, my name's Harry Maxwell. I'm a recent graduate working in London for a tech company. My question is, something I see that very often, technology is changing very fast. There are new apps coming up. So from a government perspective or people trying to help us, how can you keep up with what is going on and have the speed and skill required to respond?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to invite Paddy to make a stab at responding to some of that.
Sure. So I'm not sure I agree about not keeping up with the technology and not focusing there, and I'll give you an example why. So Twitter are very interesting. Twitter have done quite well to remove terrorist and other abusing content, but they get a certain percentage of what is visible they remove. Interestingly, when it comes to malware and any intrusion sets, they don't let it on the platform. So when you have the conversation with Twitter, you say to them, couldn't you just stop Islamic State being on your platform just by cutting them off? They say, oh no, we couldn't do that. So why can you do it with malware and why can't you do it with Islamic State? Because the way you do it with malware is you spot the originator and the nature of the origin of the message, and then you block it off. You don't study each line of malware to see whether it's malware, because you can't know. Yeah. So you do need to know technology, otherwise they run rings around you. I think it's a really interesting thing about the way in which we keep up with new applications arriving, and that is that when someone codes an application, it is a moral act. Yeah? The way in which they set up their application, both in the details of the individual lines of code and whether that creates a vulnerability, which will cause, even if the application delivers the apparent product that's wanted, actually it makes it incredibly insecure. We wouldn't allow that to happen with a car manufacturer. We wouldn't say you can make a nice shiny car that drives fast, but unfortunately it crashes and kills half the people. We'd say, no, you can't do that. So that I think there's a really heavy obligation on the part of producers of apps and indeed internet companies and social media companies both, for what goes on in their technology. And I know that's right, and I would say that I'm, as a recovering member of the deep state, I also think that they should be, the really big challenge to our society, I absolutely agree with Jamie, is around our police services' ability to police in the future when every crime is in some sense internet enabled. Yeah? And I think that's a critical point. As you design the technology, you've got to build in the ability to deal with criminality, because not all of us are good.
You have to stop being mean to back office police people. When you say we don't need any more back office police, we need frontline staff. It's like back office police are frontline staff now.
I mean,
We've got to change the way we talk about it.
One senior police officer who was confronted by somebody saying, why don't we see more bobbies on the street? And he just said, the bobby in the street is not going to help the young girl, age 14, being groomed as she sits at her computer. Unfortunately, there is a lot of crime that takes place over the media, over some different social media accounts, and there is a huge job there that is being done by the police, because we ask the police not just to respond to and stop crimes, but to protect the vulnerable. And young people are now more and more vulnerable than ever before because of their access to who knows who over the internet. Okay, can I invite some other questions? Yes.
Hi, Cherith Haitley. I have my own technology company. I've got a question for Jamie. You said data is the oil of the new economy and we should exercise our rights over our data. But also, not that many people are using Facebook anymore. So what are your comments on that?
Well, a lot of people are still using Facebook. I know some of the young kids aren't. They're going on Instagram, which is owned by Facebook. So, I mean, and WhatsApp. Yeah, I mean, so
It's owned by Facebook as well.
I guess what I'm suggesting is that part of the job here is that we citizens need to appreciate that we are entirely complicit in building the problem we are now complaining about, because we are fueling all of this with our data and our shares and our clicks and our swipes. And therefore, we need to be slightly more responsible with it. We think about the political implications of where we put our data and what we do with it. Government can help us do that. The gentleman mentioned education. I mean, being able to discriminate between different types of information is the single most important thing you can learn in schools now, without a doubt. But I think that there's a much bigger problem going on here. It's really important that we don't all become rabidly anti-technology.
I agree.
And there is a bit of a risk of that happening at the moment. But people need to believe that technology is empowering them and helping them and is liberating them and works for them. And that's going to be a really difficult thing to balance, but I think that's exactly the job. We have to win the race for artificial intelligence with China. That's like so important, but we have to do it with one arm tied behind our back because we've got to worry about privacy all the time, which is really good. But it's a tremendous challenge. And I think things like the future of tax raising powers, the shape of our economy, and more people thinking potentially that, not that there's going to be millions of unemployed, but inequality grows because technology benefits those who use it well and not those who don't. And these are enormous challenges in order to make sure that people still believe in tech and we don't have more Ted Kaczynskis out there. So this to me is a far more fundamental thing, and data, it seems to me, sits at the heart of that, and it's something that we can do something about now.
Thank you. I think that point on artificial intelligence is so important, I must say. I mean, I meet young people now who say they're choosing jobs which they know will still be there in a few years' time because they recognise how it's changing. And government needs to recognise that and make sure that the skills that we sponsor, that we help people get, are going to be able to respond to that. Okay, can I take another question here from this gentleman and then from that gentleman? Thank you. And I'll come on to you later. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Carl Thompson from Interrail Consulting. I was just wondering, where does the balance in terms of the greater threat lie? Is it through our own behaviours with regards to fake news and political advertising, or is it aggressive actions by foreign states or countries like Russia and China? And also, we've talked a lot about the role of the tech companies and social media platforms, but is there a greater role that should be played by the established antivirus and cybersecurity commercial vendors as well?
Okay, thank you. And then the other gentleman.
My name's Chris Scott. I'm a shareholder in a small software development company. A question for you, Paddy. Very interesting what you said about the moral responsibility of those who code for what's done with that code. The difficulty with any newly coded app or application may be done for the educational market, for example, but it's extremely difficult to know whether anyone will take that and use it for sort of bad purposes. So it's rather like saying to a Saab Scania who produce a truck that's then used as a truck bomb, how there is nowhere that anyone can go to or refer to say, look, we think we've identified the second order effects or the opportunity to misuse this software, but we're not sure. Clearly the state has resources and capabilities that can say, hang on, had you thought of this, that with a very small difference to what you've developed, and the problem for technology startups is everything is about being there to market first and having something that is really groundbreaking. And if you then share it with anybody, then you lose that advantage. So there is two directly opposing pressures.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. I'm going to ask Damian to answer the first one about the balance of threats and then ask Paddy to answer the issue about the moral responsibility of coding. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think if you look at it as a sort of balance of responsibilities, it's a lot of the tech companies say, we need much better user education, we should be investing more in user education, and what James said is right about that. Of course we should. There's a slight danger then that you abdicate the responsibility to the users. You say, well, actually, it's the user's responsibility to defeat fake news because they're the ones that are viewing the content. But the way the systems will work and are designed make the problem a lot harder. So if you don't know when you go on a Facebook page where the person is in the world who's posting the content on there, and that they're not in Yorkshire, they're actually in St. Petersburg, then it's very difficult for you to use the correct judgment or weighted judgment you might use over that content because you don't know enough about it. Now, the tech companies are bringing in much tougher restrictions now on identifying the sources of information and tagging them. So people will start to have some of those tools available, but some of the pushback for us to the tech companies has to be, even with good digital literacy, you're not giving people the tools they need to make a decision. The other thing is the way the platform are designed. It's designed to serve you more of the content it thinks you're interested in. So what you see when you go on the Facebook newsfeed on your Facebook account is not an organic list of the most recent things your friends have been posting. It is the system guessing which content you're most interested in and ranking that more highly. So if you're targeted with political content that's been created for you based on a deep psychological analysis of your behaviour, and you start to engage with that content, you'll start to see more of it. If you start sharing it with your friends, they'll see more of it too, and they may share similar things back as well. The space is being curated around you based on the platform guessing what you're interested in as well. And that's how these bubble effects take place, where people actually aren't exposed to a plurality of views and opinions online. They increasingly see more of the same thing, And that's why I think there is some responsibility for the tech companies about how they curate that space. And it's right, there should be some challenge for us to them about whether they're being responsible in the way that they do it.
Thank you. And Paddy, when you answer the gentleman at the back's question, could you also address, I did read somewhere that some people were proposing that there should be like a Hippocratic oath for coders as well, so that they should do good when they design.
Yeah. So I think I strongly disagree with you. And I strongly disagree with you because as people code, we are so far from them writing the best possible secure code that they can. and then it just being a matter of, other people misusing it. A number of significant hacks, for want of a better word, so stealing of data, intrusions and stealing of data recently, have happened because of poorly written third-party script. So someone constructs something and they just lift from someone else's coding and drop into it a piece of script, and that piece of script is then vulnerable when you get someone clever inside your system looking for a way in which they can divert data by changing where data is sent by that script. Forgive me. So, and frankly, so many application developers are doing just that, that they're coding actually a relatively small amount of it, and then they're dumping other stuff in. We must not be fooled by ones and zeros, right? This is an industry like any other. If a food manufacturer was dropping weird stuff into their product that you didn't know quite what it did and demonstrably had a bad effect, you know, they'd be gone. They'd be gone like a shot. So I think it may be much later when we've got dynamic analysis of a code as it's being written, and there's a focus on developing and improving that technology, and when, frankly, we're writing into our contracts with other corporations, are writing in their contracts with suppliers a liability that probably affects their insurability. Then we'll be near the point where you need to have a conversation about whether there's something else that can be done. But we're so far from that. And above all else, across the tech sector, the thing, and Damian just did it, the thing we need to avoid is everybody in the tech sector, when it comes to something that's going to affect costs, does that. And says someone else must be responsible for this, it's that guy or this guy, it's government or it's the user. Mustn't have it. There must be. Now, I think the positive, now that's a pretty deep state negative way of thinking of it. A positive way of thinking of it is coders are really vital, and those working in the applications and those working with data are really critical to not just to our economic well-being, but actually increasingly, given the way healthcare is going, to our well-being. And so this is a really important thing that they do, and there is a societal value to it, and there should be a standard. And we should say, oh, you're a coder, what a good thing. Just like, the Peter Donnelly at Oxford University just raised 25 million for, I think, stage B of a genomics program, right? He's a statistician. He's surrounded by tech folk. He's going to change our healthcare, yeah? And so we should say to him, Peter, fantastic, you're a coder. Yeah. Great.
Fantastic, thank you. Yes, some more questions. We'll take two. Yes, James? And the gentleman over there, please. And then I'll come to the front row. Thank you.
I'm James Bethel. I ran a campaign against extremism, and I'm now in the House of Lords. I wanted to ask a sort of positive question about policy, and ask each of the panel members to suggest a positive policy suggestion to try and tackle this. In particular, I was thinking about what Jamie said about erosion of trust in national institutions. I was thinking what people were saying about education and the need for coders. I was thinking about the police and what they need to do in order to step up to the mark. I was thinking about Ofcom and what they need to do to regulate. What are the kinds of things that we can do about this? Because otherwise, we're all going to leave this tent feeling very depressed indeed.
Yes, there's another question. We'll take it at the same time.
Hi, my name's Rupert Maspero. I run a technology-based business in Cheltenham, so kind of like the hub of cyber security, basically, in the country. And I find it quite concerning that a lot of people talking about legislation and regulation here seem to fail to understand some really core basics about how the technology you're trying to regulate works. And so my question is kind of, how important do you think it is that as politicians and as people looking to regulate that industry, do you really actually understand what it is that you're doing?
Okay, I'm going to just jump on that for last question. I don't think you need to be a coder to understand the problems we have. And there is something that happens where any politician gets up and says, I think we need to look at this or we need to do this. And there is hate-filled barrage that comes of it at you. Some of it from the PR advisors at some of the larger companies that might not like what you're saying. So I've developed a little bit of a thick skin about this one because I can get the advice. There's some fantastic experts sitting on this table here this morning, and politicians can get the advice they need to be able to help to find the solutions. Of course, we don't understand it in the way I expect you do, Rupert. about more later, I'm sure. But I don't think it should stop us at all having the confidence to get the expertise from elsewhere and make sure we do protect people. Now James asked us for some optimistic suggestions about what we should be doing about these big problems. Now, Jamie's been writing a number of books about this and looking at it. What would be your first
Yeah, but they're
step?
all really pessimistic, though. But my editor did actually make me put in some positive proposals. I've got a couple for you really quickly. The first one, it speaks to a couple of points raised already, is we do need some kind of, I know you're not going to like this, everybody, but a sort of Ofcom for algorithms, a kind of off-algo. Because increasingly, important decisions will be made by machines, and there needs to be some way in which those decisions can be scrutinized. And it might be spot tests, it might be in response to specific complaints, but that is, I mean, it's going to be so important in a decade's time, and you'll have all sorts of injustices derived from computer says no, and people will need to feel there is a system that can regulate that. But maybe a more positive but less government-led one. I mentioned already about incentivizing the private sector to help an industry of data, like individual data ownership. I think it's really important. But also in the health sector, if we in this country do not become the leaders in digital healthcare, in using the health data sets that we have, which are the best in the world, to be able to create dozens of amazing health tech startups, and we leave it to a small number of big tech firms from California who do have better computing power than us, that will be a disaster. Not just for the health of this economy, but how we regulate it, how we tax it, how we control it. So the government is going to have to really incentivize this sector, not just for the health of the economy, but so it can still regulate it properly.
Yeah. Such a good point about regulation. Damian, anything for you?
Yes, so in our Select Committee report, there's a lot of policy recommendations, and the government will shortly have to respond to them. But there is a role for, I think, a company like, for an organisation like Ofcom in looking at. I think for me there are two areas. There's content side and there's kind of data side. The content side, there's no reason why Ofcom couldn't have oversight of that, just as they do for broadcasting and other things as well, where the government says, okay, we say this is harmful content, some of it's already illegal and in breach of your community guidelines if you're a social media company, that shouldn't be there. If that's referred to you within 24 hours and you don't take it down, then you have a liability. I think if we establish that liability, all of a sudden we would find they're a lot more efficient at getting rid of the bad stuff. Now, if I started posting Premier League goals without copyright license for it on Facebook and YouTube, that content would not be there very long. It would come down really quickly because the tech companies know that the owners of that content are incredibly litigious, and therefore they act. There's not a commercial incentive for them to act, and therefore they haven't acted. I think I don't know whether we need a new sort of off-algo, but what we might need is the ICO to have, I think, to beef up the role of the ICO. The ICO is already our data policewoman, and Elizabeth Denham can go into companies now and actually seize data and information as part of an investigation. We were in a position before where we had to just take the word of the tech companies that they were complying with the law, but they can go in. I think there should be a role for like spot checking the way companies are working, for someone to have the right to go in and see for themselves. And so I think the ICO could take on more of that role. And I think if we did those two things, it would give us a much surer footing. I think to what Amber said earlier on, it's absolutely right for politicians to identify issues of harm and to set a framework by which the companies have acted. I don't have to write the piece of code that gets rid of a jihadi recruitment video on YouTube. I just have to say to YouTube, you've got to do it, and if you don't do it, there's a penalty. Yeah,
absolutely right. I'm going to ask Julian for his comments, and I'm going to see if we get some more questions in, please.
Thank you. An opportunity to create policy is a great opportunity. So I think the only thing I would say is, if you remember when we met, when you were Home Secretary, we talked about taking the liability of cyber terrorism off the government's balance sheet by placing it into the private sector. And that's exactly what we did by expanding our cover. But I mentioned earlier that there are $4 billion worth of cyber premium. That is the entire global premium volume for cyber. That is not a lot of money. And the reason, what that means is, therefore, there's an awful lot of everything you've been discussing in this room today that is not insured. And what that creates is a moral hazard for government, because implicitly, effectively, the government may decide to step in if something large happens. Actually, I think if you have, I'm not going to say a duty, but if there was a collaboration, a public-private partnership where insurers like myself are encouraged to think about how we can evolve and expand our cover, to cover these things in collaboration with people like Paddy who know what they're talking about and the people on this panel, we will find ways to ensure and close the gap that currently exists.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I take some more questions, please? Yes, I said these two gentlemen at the front here. We can have the microphone here. And then now, of course, as we reach our last part, lots of questions coming, so we'll try and be as quick as possible.
My name's Russell. I'm a counsellor, teacher and a father of two, and also suffering from a cold, so very sorry about
Sorry
that.
to hear that, Russell.
So my question relates to the impact it's having more on children. It's the advances with social media, technology is fantastic, but it seems with every advance, the better. We seem to get the negatives come back tenfold. And I want to focus on some of more of the old school or old world laws that we use in other realms. So, for example, fireworks. When my mum and dad were little, you used to be able to go and buy fireworks. You can't do that anymore. When my granddad was at school, he could take a penknife into school because they used to skin things. You know, we don't do that anymore. It doesn't mean that children don't get hold of those things, but it's a cultural shift. It says, no, these are not right. Now, most of the children I teach, they get their information through one of these. So why is it when you buy one of these, you don't have to produce some ID to have the apps or technology released on them? It wouldn't stop children accessing the social media, but it would send a cultural message to people that you have to be a certain age before you can use them. Yes, education's good, like with fireworks, like with knives, but we still don't let people just have them. And I think we need to consider that more, because the technology that we're using at the moment has moved on so quickly that I don't think legislation has kept up, and the impact, the mental impact it's having on children, as I'm sure you're all well aware, is profound.
Okay, thank you very much. You could pass the mic over to this gentleman here.
My name is Kerim Balcı. I'm an exiled Turkish journalist here, a victim of anti-terrorism laws. My question is rather about the balance between regulation and freedom, and implications of tougher regulations formulated here in non-democratic countries. After 9/11, United Kingdom and many Western countries reformulated their anti-terrorism laws. My country in Turkey adopted it, but the authoritarian regime decided to use it not against the terrorists, but against completely innocent, decent voices. Myself, having need to flee the country. I am against tech companies not complying by means of taking off ISIS sites and so on. But I am quite happy with the fact that the Turkish government has asked 7 times to Twitter to take me off because of my critical opposition status, and Twitter didn't comply with that. Where we will stop? Where we are going to have the red line?
Well, this is, of course, a live debate all the time about that balance between regulation and freedom, and the danger of people who try and ask, for instance, Twitter to be much more responsive to government requests is that they will say, well, we better do that for Turkey and China too, hence the problem. Do you want to just make a couple of comments on that, Paddy, on the terrorist regulations? And perhaps, Damian, you'd address this Russell's point about whether we can have controlled apps for children.
So we already have something of a frame for distinguishing between radicalizing content or unacceptable content that will have pernicious effect and lead to violence, and content that is merely a political opposition. And we already have that in our national discourse, you know, leave the internet aside. So we have to have the beginning of that. I'm also struck that in our legislation in this country, the work of Amber and Damian, we've got a very clear respect for privacy and for the rights of individuals and the right of expression, and you certainly have that in the United States. And as we steer our way through this, we've got to be constantly thinking that we're dealing with a technology, whatever we think of it, that is largely dominated by the decisions of the Congress of the United States.
Yeah.
So there's a virtuous way through this, and I think the virtuous way through this is to be true to what we do within the United Kingdom and the choices that our sovereign parliament makes about the balances between, you know, duties and freedoms. And then, personally, and I think I said this earlier, and it would be my positive good that I put forward, I think it's a really good idea to have a broad international frame where we attempt to say, as we have done with other issues of concern, and certainly around warfare, there are some things that are acceptable and there are some things that are not. And into that you can build a degree of respect for privacy and the right to control of data, the prevention of violence, but also the protection of freedoms of speech. And you can begin to have that kind of discourse, difficult though it is.
Okay, thank you.
I think it's a really important question, and actually it's a subject area around, if you like, the addictive quality of social media, the disruptive nature in people's lives and impact on children in particular is something I'd also like the committee to look at more in the next year as well. If you're not already familiar with it, I'd recommend a campaign that started in California called Time Well Spent, which a guy called Tristan Harris leads. He used to work for Google. He set it up with some people that used to work with from Facebook as well, where they're actually looking at the whole nature of social media through your smartphone device. The whole thing is designed to be as addictive as possible, to make you spend as much time on it as possible. So, could we look with younger users about time limits, and that could be built into the system? I think it's quite possible for YouTube and Facebook in particular and Instagram and Snapchat and others to guess whether someone is a child using it, regardless of what they've said when they logged in and set the account up, because of the way in which they interact with it. Maybe some of the tools that are there for adult users aren't there in quite the same way. I think there's an ethical debate for the industry now about the way in which we seek to tempt and engage very young children to engage with it as a tool. I mean, you of course then get into serious issues like cyberbullying and the sort of content that they create on there. I saw a really interesting tool that was shown to the committee by the BBC that they've been developing, which can read posts of young people, and if they think they're about to post something mean, can challenge them about whether they really want to post that or not. So I think that we could use smart technology in a really positive and creative way. I think we do need to have a sort of proper discussion with the tech companies about the way in which these tools are set up for younger users.
I completely agree with that.
Can I say something very, very briefly to this gentleman? Because I think there's a slight difference between, for example, saying, can you abide by the rule of a democratically elected government and make sure that it's enforced fully? And what I sometimes see, which is politicians demanding that changes are made to the technology itself. We want to build an encryption backdoor, or we want to make changes to this particular piece of software, and that piece of software is used all over the world. And I think those two things are actually quite different. So when politicians say we want to stop people using Tor, or we want to build a backdoor into Tor, this is the way you get onto the darknet, it's the first book I wrote, that's a massive problem, because that is maybe, yes, used by drug dealers and terrorists and others, but it is also used by journalists all around the world. And you make a change for the bad guys, all the good guys are going to suffer too. But I think that is not quite the same as we've passed this law in this democratic country and we want it to be enforced.
Yes, I'm a bit stung by that, Jamie, to be honest, because I don't think politicians are saying we want to get a backdoor into those encrypted sites. What we do say, though, is we think that the encrypted site owners have a responsibility to work with government when it's in everybody's interest. I mean, when I went to see Facebook about the Global Internet Forum for Counterterrorism, and Facebook were very helpful. And when I went to see WhatsApp about wanting not a backdoor, though it is quickly characterised as a backdoor by people who like to point out that politicians don't understand what they're doing, Rupert, what we were asking for was metadata. We were asking for very simple, fair, the sort of information they would give paid, the people who are paying them. Perfectly reasonable data. And they were reluctant, in fact, they didn't at that point engage with us on it. They're saying it's not in our business plan. And so I thought that sort of level of hostility against government, even putting us subservient to some of their larger paid users, was unacceptable, I have to say. Okay, can we take some more questions, please? Yes, this gentleman here and this gentleman here. I'm conscious I haven't taken enough questions from women, so
I didn't mention you, Amber.
Oh, yes, that's true.
That's fine.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Josh. I'm a political consultant from Dodds. I just had a question. Is there an issue with regards to a discrepancy between public awareness of cyber terrorism and conventional terrorism? We've seen how conventional terrorism can affect public behaviour, public confidence, and indeed attitudes. Can we seek to raise public awareness as it pertains to cyber terrorism, and might that actually affect how people interact with new technology, social media, because they're slightly more aware of the threat that cybersecurity and cyber threats pose?
Thank you. And there was a gentleman behind here. I think this one is here, the 30th, reaching for the microphone.
Hello, my name's Mark Gooch. I run a technology company and I'm also a local councillor. So I'm
fairly unusual person in that I see this from both sides. I mean, it has to be said, and we've already heard this hinted at and stated already in this, that the majority of politicians tend not to understand tech very well.
Oh, there he goes again.
Allow me to finish, because I haven't improved. The reality is, to be honest, that is generally true, although Alex prepared to add a present company accepted to that. But the counterpart to that is that the majority of the tech community doesn't understand politics. There's a huge difference in language between both camps that really gets in the way of reaching any common ground here. The tech community tends to interpret regulation as censorship and resists legitimate concerns as an assault on freedom, while the political community, on their hand, dismisses technical issues as just tech-splaining and talking down to people. And there's a real difficulty in getting any useful interaction between the two groups because we are literally talking a different language. So my question to the panel is simply, how do we overcome that?
James, do you want to address some of that? How do we...
Get you involved, probably,
yes,
from the sounds of it. Well, no, I completely agree with that. I'm not sure what the answer is precisely, although if you think that in 20 years' time, a lot of the politicians will probably be a bit more au fait just with the general language of technology, because it will be, they'll have done much more intensive programming at school.
True.
And I think technologists are getting dragged into politics more and more now, whereas a decade ago they thought they sat beautifully outside all of this messy, mucky business. They are becoming more au fait with the language of politics. So I kind of think and hope that might resolve itself in the next decade or so.
With time, yes.
Yeah.
Paddy, are you leaning forward to say something here on this one, or on the cyber terrorism versus terrorism?
Well, I'm happy to do cyber terrorism. I think we should be very clear that actually we haven't seen the terrorists being able to get much beyond, frankly, messing about on the World Wide Web, something called doxing, and where you kind of expose people's data in the hope that someone will target them. And just stopping for a moment and thinking, how do you spot a terrorist? It's quite good when a terrorist is active on the internet because they leave traces. So I think we're in a kind of a nice position at the moment where we could go amiss by talking about terrorism, cyber terrorism as a focus. Cyber crime, that is where any of us in this room could go and buy the tools to cause significant damage. You just go and buy it, start using it, and it's really easy to do. And it's really pernicious. It's in the criminal area. It's again in law enforcement. It's Jamie's point about that's where the front line of cyber security is. And when you've done that, it's like being in a forest with a high build-up of undergrowth. When we've cut down a lot of that kind of slightly lower tech, slightly more preventable criminal activity, we're left with some really significant problems through state action. Because if a serious state like Russia really decides it's going to have a go at you, it's very difficult to secure critical national infrastructure systems. And actually, we need to clear away the undergrowth and get on with that problem, which is why we should have urgency about it.
Final question from the lady at the back on the right, please, and then we're going to wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you. Claire Levins, Internet Matters. We help parents keep their kids safe online. 96% of parents accept that online safety for kids is their responsibility. 70% don't know what to do. And when we ask them what their concerns are, it's the classic things. Stranger danger. Are they going to be cyberbullied? Are they going to be contacted by a paedophile, etc.? They are nowhere. Parents are nowhere on the type of issues that you've been talking about today. And I guess my question really is how, as policymakers and leading thinkers in this area, do we bring most of the population along with us such that you get the public consent to create the policies that you want to create, which will keep us safer?
Well, I think that comes back to the earlier points that were being made by the panel here, is that the mood is changing. The mood is changing from the public. They no longer see social media as sort of this purest good, but they do recognise all the difficulties that are taking place. And I think that people are crying out for the additional advice like that you've referred to keep their families safe. I'm going to, I'm afraid, conclude there because we have to finish on time. I want to thank everybody for coming here, for participating, and for your fantastic questions. I've been stung slightly by the question from James about what's the good news here. There is plenty of good news here. I hope that you heard about that as well. The point about the UK wanting to get ahead in terms of making sure that we're the most advanced on using data for good, for health, with Matt Hancock leading on that. I think we can do that. And on artificial intelligence. Jamie's absolutely right. We need to get ahead of China. We need to make sure that we are the country that's leading on that and that we have the right regulation in place to pull it together. So thank you all for coming. And thank you to my fantastic panel and to Policy Exchange for hosting us.